Hey guys, how's it going? It's Dudey Rhino here, and I am back with another video. Today's video is based around human experimentation, specifically on children. Now, it goes without needing to be said, really, that obviously a lot of what you're going to hear today is disturbing. If you're of a nervous disposition, then I would suggest that maybe this isn't the video for you. Last year I did many videos on human experimentation, from Unit 731 to American human experimentation. It's a topic that interests me. I know it's a topic that interests a lot of you at home, so I thought I would delve back into certain times in our history where ethics and morals just simply went out the window. Without further ado, I guess it's time to delve into the worst human experimentation done to children. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a big question in the science scene. It was nature versus nurture. And some psychologists ran a secret experiment throughout those decades where they split up twins and triplets. They had them adopted as single orphan children. One of the craziest parts is apparently this experiment was partially funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. This experiment's secrecy was blown wide open when three triplets found each other by chance in the 1980s. There is a documentary on Netflix that you can watch about this, which is fascinating and gives a much deeper insight into the triplets and what was going on. At the time, of course, they had no idea that they were siblings because, well, they didn't realize at any point in their life up to this point that they were actually triplets. In 1997, Robert Shafran was quoted saying, "How can you do this with little children? How can you do this to a little baby, innocent children being torn apart at birth?" His brother David Kalman also felt deeply angry with this experiment and said, "We were robbed of 20 years together." Unfortunately, their brother Edward Galland tragically committed suicide in 1995. It's not known to what extent this experiment had in the lead up to that suicide. This experiment was headed by Peter Neubauer and Viola Bernard. The two at no point showed any remorse for what they did to innocent children, and in fact said the opposite of remorse and said that they thought that they were doing the right thing for the children, separating them so that they could develop their own personalities as individuals. The strange thing about this experiment is that the results, whatever that may be, that they found from doing this is actually sealed in documentation that is not allowed to legally be opened till the year 2066 in Yale University. The Monster Study. In 1939, speech pathologists at the University of Iowa set out to prove a thesis that stuttering was in fact a learned behaviour, not a genetic one. It's a learned behaviour because it is caused by children's anxiety and stress about speaking. That was their idea. Unfortunately, in order to prove this thesis, the way that they went about it was they were going to try and prove it by using orphans and making them scared of speaking. They sat down with the children at the Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Ohio home and told them that they were actually showing signs of stuttering. Of course they weren't. And on top of that, not only telling them that they showed signs of stuttering, said that you should not speak unless you are confident that you will not stutter. Now, obviously, saying this to a developing child would have all sorts of effects. Fortunately, it didn't actually cause stuttering because stuttering is not a learned behaviour, but it did make children that were deemed normal before to be withdrawn, silent, and anxious. Future Iowa pathology students dubbed this study the Monster Study because of how immoral it was to do that to children. 3 surviving children and the estates of others received $925,000 after suing the university for this experimentation. Canada's inhumane testing on Indigenous children. In 1933, around 600 Indigenous children were selected against their will, no consent given at any any point to be tested for a tuberculosis vaccine. In both the control and treatment groups, nearly a fifth of those injected died. Parental consent was never sought for any of the indigenous children. However, non-indigenous children that were also part of the trials, the consent was gained from their parents. Between the years of 1942 and 1952, malnourished children from 6 separate schools were used in these experiments. They were split into these treatment and control groups. Now, despite the children clearly being malnourished, the researchers never at any point gave them any additional food because they wanted to see if the fact that they were malnourished contributed in any way towards this vaccine. They were testing combinations of supplements and things like that. Now, this of course, as I said, caused deaths, it caused anemia, and due to the nature of the testing, a lot of the children developed cavity problems and dental issues like gingivitis, and at never at any point were they offered dental care, despite the testing being the cause of these issues. I didn't feel like I could do a video like this without mentioning the Nazis and Josef Mengele and his twin experiments in concentration camps such as Auschwitz and Dachau. I have done a full video on Josef Mengele if you'd like more detail and a deeper dive into what was going on there. You can just type in Dudey, Rhino, Josef Mengele and it will come up. In short, the experimentation on children, twins more specifically, there were over 3,000 that died and were tested on during the era of the concentration camps. They were exposed to disease, they were disfigured, they were cut open, they were sewed shut, they were sewed together. Truly, truly abhorrent conditions and treatment of any human being, let alone a child. All of this torture was apparently in the name of medical research and eugenics and in the pursuit of creating a sustainable and efficient way of increasing the population of the Aryan race. If you were a twin, you'd be split. There'd be one test and one control. One would be sat there while the other one was tested on to see if they shared pain. And like I said, some would be sewn together. Sometimes eyes would be removed and put into the other one to see if they worked. Limbs would be cut off and then sewn onto the other again to see if they worked. Conjoined twins. And it was absolutely abhorrent. Those that died were then dissected and studied further. Once one of the twins died, the other one would be killed, as they wouldn't be seen as useful anymore to Josef Mengele, and then they would also be dissected and studied. But like I say, I have a specific video dedicated to that topic if you want to go and watch that. Charlie Dyer. He was an orphan in the 1950s and went to a school called Fernald State School in Waltham, Massachusetts. Early on in his time at this school, he was persuaded to join a science club. A quote from Charlie says, "They told us that they'd give us a Mickey Mouse watch and send us on field trips and to baseball games. We all jumped at the chance to get in. But the trips were incredibly rare and sparse. Normally, they were individually put into wards, bloods were taken constantly, they were only allowed to relieve themselves into glass jars, and when Dyer had had enough and asked to leave the club, he was told that he was not allowed to leave." Years later, he found out that actually he was part of a clinical trial testing radiation. Every morning, the boys that were part of the science club were given breakfast. It was oatmeal that was laced with radioisotope milk. They literally gave these boys radiation in the guise of a fun science club to test radiation on children. Dr. Kligman famously discovered Retin A, which is an acne treatment. However, Dr. Kligman's experiments involved mentally ill children at the state colonies for the feeble-minded in Vineland and Woodbine, New Jersey, and with a grant from the US Public Health Service, tested on mentally ill children in the most horrid way. Kligman would take these mentally ill children and infect their scalps with a severe form of ringworm. And another experiment that he did exposed their scalps to formalin, which is a chemical very close to formaldehyde. So he took mentally ill children, tortured them, and exposed them to horrific chemicals, horrific infections to further his research into acne prevention. And lastly, we'll talk about Dr. Weibel. He ran a meningitis study out of Hamburg. Again, mentally ill children were used. The parents gave consent after the trials had already been done. They were lied to, saying these trials are absolutely fine, they're all passed, blah, 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 blah. Whereas in reality, their poor children had already gone through these unregulated trials, asserting that it had been approved by the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children. Now, bearing in mind, these trials involved, giving meningitis to mentally ill children, when asked if the pain of the children was ever taken into consideration or monitored, Weibel simply replied that they take their temperature. So there we go, guys. There's some horrific, historic, global human experiments specifically done to children. What do you guys think? Do you like this kind of historic content? Do let me know down below. I like reading all of your comments and seeing what you guys think. Hit that like button, share the channel, share the video, because I feel like things like this shouldn't be forgotten. Abhorrent, horrific injustices to these people in the past need to be remembered, and that's why this sort of content is made. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it. I'll see you very soon. Sweet one, guys.